raise a glass to the past and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome, one and all, to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Crosstime Pub, rapping about Flint napping. And, of course, catching up here over a nice draft and welcoming the autumn weather. It's that time of the year. I'm getting excited, and I'm sure that the fine folks here that hang out, I mean, the only other people who ever show up here in the Crosstime Pub alongside yours truly, Jason Pentrail and James Waldo, probably feel the same. You know, Jason, I know in recent days, you having been out there on the road, you must be getting into the spirit of the autumn season, sir.
Yeah, you know, it was great to get back on the road, and I kind of caught the last little part of, you know, summer. We got a little bit of heat, but it was fun. So, yeah, I headed out west across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and stayed the night in Tupelo, the home of the King, Elvis Presley. So cute little town, never been there before. It was cool to check it out. And then the next day I headed on up to Parkin Mounds there in northeast Arkansas and had a beautiful day there. It's a great site. I really enjoyed seeing it. We got some new content for our Mound Builder series. It was a good time. And then from there, headed over to Pinson Mounds for the 40th annual ArchaeoFest event. And I have to say, gentlemen, it was a huge success for the podcast. Met lots of great people. We had people coming from up to 4.5 hours away to meet Seven Ages. Had a lot of people asking about both of you gentlemen. But we did get an opportunity to meet several of our listeners, quite a few actually. And again, it was always humbling to have that opportunity. We were also joined by Barry Anderson, one of our listeners who came all the way from Winter Park, Florida for the event. So he came up and hung out with us. Ren Harvey, another good friend of ours, was there. She had her tent set up right beside us. And so again, a great opportunity for networking. And it's always humbling and honoring to get out there and meet some of the people that are listening to the show. So big thanks to everyone there at Pinson for having us. It was a beautiful day, beautiful weekend, and I really couldn't ask for anything more. It was a great experience.
Yeah, so rub it in, why don't you? I am sorry I missed that. I was really looking forward to it, but I don't know if Jason had said anything or not, but the week of the trip, I got COVID. My wife and I both.
Oh, really? I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, I've had better. It was really irritating, and we were just sick enough, you know, we're obviously not going anywhere. We worked the whole time. I mean, I didn't take off work or anything, but I certainly missed the trip. I really regret missing meeting all of the people that came out to meet us. That was probably the worst thing, you know. And Jason came all the way over to Parkin here in Arkansas, and you know, just down the road. But I mean, it just wasn't in the cards this year.
Yeah, well, that's a very legitimate excuse, by the way. And, you know, James, I'm glad you and the wife are on the mend. Between my 4 jobs, of course, I was working that weekend and ever steadily making progress in that sphere of things, but keeping a watchful eye on social media. And Jason always out there representing us and doing a fine job, in fact. Now, guys, I'll tell you, speaking of some of the work that I do, this is probably not very well known outside of our archaeological circles, but in recent days, due to my apparent, possibly mutant capability of attracting black bears, I've been tasked informally with keeping tabs on the black bear population here around Asheville, North Carolina. And it was a rather curious set of circumstances that led to this development, if you want to call it that. On the way home from a recent visit to a local tavern and bar and grill, I had been driving and saw a strange, hairy creature step out in the road in front of me. I've already given away the goods here. You know, it was a black bear. Nothing strange and esoteric, but it was a black bear that had a collar around its neck. And so as I pulled up very close to this bear, I, snapped a couple of photographs of it, sent some of those to some friends, went home, didn't think much more about it. But I'll tell you this, up here in Asheville, guys, the black bears I mean, they're getting really tame, which is potentially problematic because they love to get into trash cans and things like this. But as I'm on my way home, I thought very little else about the young black bear that I'd seen. Now, later that evening, as I am lying there in bed awake, I thought I might have heard a growl outside the window, presuming it was the rather obnoxious, I shouldn't say that. Let's just say that it's a rather vocal, or perhaps, James, as you would say, verbose puppy dog next door. You know, I just figured that's what I was hearing. Put my earplugs back in, turned up the fan to help drown out the noise outside, and went back to sleep. But I awoke the following morning, with my window open, mind you, to a peculiar odor. I'm thinking, what is that smell? Almost like the Leonard Skinner song, right? And I look out the window, and sure enough, my trash has been strewn all about the driveway. A little fellow had followed me home and decided to come in and have a snack. And I'll just say this, I don't think that my trash can had been his final stop, because further evidence I was able to detect in my yard seemed to indicate that this was a very, very well-fed bear. Okay? Yes, indeed. And so, detecting all of this evidence, it was immediately evident to me that although probably not the same little fellow I'd seen crossing the road earlier that day, there was indeed a black bear closer to home. Yeah, so 2 encounters in a single day, but guys, there's more to this story than that. Because shortly thereafter, again, I'm a musician, and this was the line of work that prevented me from being able to join you, Jason. I actually had originally 3 gigs scheduled that weekend, ended up doing 2 of them. One, unfortunately, was canceled due to weather. But as I was loading up to leave for another gig yesterday, okay, I go out in the yard, and there be further evidence of the bear. He has returned, and apparently he believes my yard is his toilet. Now, we'll put this out to the listenership, how we take care of a black bear problem. Actually, fortunately, I think that problem is going to resolve itself here in the days ahead, because you know what these guys are doing is they're filling up, they're feeding, and preparing for the wintertime. They'll probably be hibernating. But man, I tell you, in Asheville, you can't turn around for seeing a black bear. And I remember back in the day, that used to be a fairly uncommon experience. Now you see them an awful lot. Do you guys ever see black bears out there in Arkansas, James?
I mean, not in town. You got town bears, man. Our bears stay in the woods. My advice to you is to move your trash cans into the neighbor's yard.
Yeah, that would probably work really well. Yeah, well, you know, what my neighbors do is we have to use bungee cords, you know, and just keep them shut so that the bears can't get in there. But, you know, one of my recent trips, I was traveling out of the state, and I came home to find my trash can spilled over onto the ground and the trash dragged down onto the south lawn. Jason, I'm sure you've seen the south lawn. I try to keep it very well cut, trimmed, and nice looking. And this probably was appealing to the bear, who decided to go and seat himself there and snack on my trash. So, you know, black bears, they are naturally drawn to me, and I suppose it's just a matter of time that the Forest Service will ask me to officially begin keeping record for them to aid in our wilderness protection efforts here. But, you know, speaking of protection efforts, guys, also we look at the past and protecting history. And a couple of times in the past, you know, one of the few guests we've had back on this program more than once is Dr. Robert Carballo. And we've discussed Teotihuacan with him many times, but there was this really great piece in Heritage Daily that I wanted to share as a bit of a callback to what Robert has shared with us during his past appearances on the Seven Ages Audio Journal. As Heritage Daily reports, for thousands of years, people living in the Sierra de las Navajas have exploited the rare deposits of obsidian, a type of volcanic glass that is formed when lava extruded from a volcano cools rapidly with minimal crystal growth. Now, obsidian, of course, as they explain, is produced from felsic lava. James, maybe I'll ask you about that here a little later. It's rich in the lighter elements such as silicon, oxygen, aluminum, sodium, and potassium. And due to the hard and brittle nature of that stone, it fractures to form extremely sharp edges. Jason and I both know, because Jason has demonstrated this in my kitchen for me once. Now, that, of course, is part of the reason why obsidian is an optimal choice when it comes to flint knapping. And so it's often been used in the past to create cutting and piercing tools, instruments for worship, or, of course, weapons either for ceremonial purposes or for warfare, for hunting, and more utilitarian types of uses. Well, apparently, Hispanic groups living in the Americas also were among those who used these, and deposits located only 31 miles from the ancient city of Teotihuacan are apparently now in the sights of researchers with the National Institute of Anthropology and History because they've located more than 500 mine shafts in the Sierra de las Navajas, a mountain range located in the southeast of the state of Hidalgo in central Mexico. Now, of course, Teotihuacan, named by the Nahuatl-speaking Aztecs and loosely translated as birthplace of the gods, sounds like a book title, guys, is an ancient Mesoamerican city located in the Teotihuacan Valley. And I would just say that for anyone who would like an excellent overview of the archaeology that has occurred there in recent years, go back in the archives, listen to the episodes that we did here on the program with Robert Carballo. But again, during Phase 2 from AD 100 to about 350, the city population at Teotihuacan had grown very rapidly into this large metropolis. And again, the excavations there have revealed the different successive stages of population growth and decline at that site for a while. But it was, at a time, a thriving urban settlement. And of course, yes, obsidian was kind of central to the lithic production that occurred there. And so it's fascinating to see these mines and their discovery. According to Heritage Daily, they say that identifying the shafts that date from the Teotihuacan era presented challenges to the researchers because many were reused or sealed during the Toltec exploitation of the region. That occurred between around 950 AD to AD 1150, and then also during the period of the Triple Alliance by the three Nahua city-states, Mexo, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, during the 16th century AD. Anyhow, I thought you guys might find that interesting. I'm always kind of on the watch for stories like this because, Jason, something that was really interesting, and this almost ties in with the Mound Builder series that you've really been working on and leading the effort with in recent months. Talking with Robert, he had described obsidian that seems to have come from this region, right? The likes of which we might have found at Teotihuacan, much further north in some of the mound sites in the Midwest. Now, that's interesting to me, but it's not entirely unexpected. I mean, to me, it seems very likely that these groups would be engaged in trade, and yet that's not something that you read about very much in modern archaeological literature, is it?
Well, in some cases, but yeah, again, it's often, hard, especially in the past. Technology is a lot better today, but it's traditionally been very difficult to trace back these materials to their origin, especially because in many cases, no one thought to look that far away. Again, we see that example up in the Ohio Valley at some of the Hopewell and Adena sites, but specifically the Hopewell have, a good bit of obsidian ceremonial blades that were never used, but were created and found there at Mound City that we had the opportunity to visit.
Oh, yeah.
And that material was coming all the way from very near the Rockies. So, I mean, again, we're seeing these very valuable and exotic goods moving great distances because of the attraction of the piece. Now, obsidian, there's green obsidian, black obsidian, rainbow obsidian, all kinds of different ones, some with gold flecks in it or pyrite flecks. It's a beautiful material. I have quite a bit of it here that I use for flint knapping, extremely sharp. And then, also in many cases translucent when you hold it up to the light. So it has many characteristics, making it one of the most sought after materials. Of course, it's a bit softer than some of the materials that we have here in the East. But, if you're depending on it for, a good sharp blade, or you're using it for hunting or whatever the case may be, it's hard to beat obsidian because it's very easy to knap and it's quickly changed. You can knock out an obsidian blade in just a few moments. So, yeah, beautiful material. And would you say 500 mine shafts down there? Is that what it was?
That's correct. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 mines, again, presumably dating back to that period that the height of the Teotihuacan metropolis would have been producing not only lithics, but their very characteristic pottery, art, so many incredible things.
Yeah, I certainly wish we had a obsidian mine here on the East Coast, but we were able to grab some of that Arkansas novaculite when we were out there with James. So nonetheless, we ended up with some good material.
Absolutely. James, when it comes to obsidian, though, really quickly, they were discussing some of the formation of obsidian that gives rise to its unique fracturing capacities that are so conducive to flint knapping. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, obsidian is literally glass. It's volcanic glass.
Right.
And you find it in volcanoes that are continental type volcanoes, right? So you talk about felsic type lava. So, lava kind of comes in two flavors. It's really silica rich, felsic, or it's very iron rich. The iron rich variety you find in ocean basins, right? Volcanoes around the Pacific Rim, Hawaii, for example, which is on a hotspot. You'll never find obsidian in Hawaii. It's just not going to occur. What happens is that the material that when the lava kind of comes up through the country rock, it melts that rock. So whatever that rock's made out of is what's the lava is, the constituents of the lava is going to be. So anywhere, on the west coast of the United States where, we have emerging coastlines and, lots of mountain building and that kind of thing, you're going to have, that type of like very felsic material. And what happens with that lava is somehow it manages to cool so quickly that none of the other mineral constituents that, are melted in the lava have time to form any other kind of crystals, right? So all you get is the silica, and you get the contaminants that give it the color black or green or, flecked with other types of minerals, but it cools so quickly that it's basically just glass. It's really kind of an interesting material in that sense. So, and it lends itself to what it lends itself to.
Yeah, I remember very fondly after one of our trips out on the road, Jason and I got back to Asheville, and he says, "This morning, sir, before I leave, you're going to have a flint knapping lesson." And that was what we worked with. It was some obsidian, and I kind of cut my teeth, and probably cut my fingers too, because it is very sharp, when you're flint knapping it. But that was quite an experience. And, for folks who would like to get a little bit of the experience of history, if you enjoy listening to our podcast, we also encourage you, especially if you make your way into the Southeast, if you're over near Sevierville, Tennessee, you might want to drop by the Smoky Mountain Relic Room. Our good pal Chase Pipes does incredible work over there. He really has the same passion for history that we all have, and he has made it his life's work to be able to make that available to the public. Jason, did you manage to stop in over there while you were on your recent travels?
Well, I absolutely did. No trip to Tennessee would be complete without stopping by Sevierville, Tennessee, and the Smoky Mountain Relic Room. So yeah, as I made my way back, I drove from Archaeo Fest and there at Pinson Mounds, and then I drove over to Sevierville that night and stayed about 1.5 miles from the shop. And yeah, when they opened up the next morning, I went over there and spent a little time, picked up some gifts for the kids. I got my oldest son, his first dinosaur tooth, so he was super stoked about that. And so it was a great time. Unfortunately, Chase wasn't there. He was out on the road. He does spend about half of his year out there on the road every year. He's been doing it since he was a child.
Oh, yeah.
And so, he's at the Denver Mineral, Fossil, Gem, and Jewelry Show. He's been there for quite a while, and he's now making his way back towards Sevierville with pallets and crates of fossils, minerals, T-Rex teeth, you name it, he's got it. And he's bringing literally truckloads of stuff back to the Relic Room just in time for the holiday season. So again, with the expansion of the store, it's much bigger, much more floor space there, and they have filled up every square inch. So again, make your way over there. And, there's the Smoky Mountain Knife works as well. So there's plenty of things to see, plenty of things to do. Even if you got kids, they're going to love it. It's always a good time. Again, our sponsor for the show, the Smoky Mountain Relic Room. And you can also shop online at therelicroom.com, the largest diversity of history for sale in North America.
Absolutely. And while you're at it, head on over there to YouTube, check out Chasing History, Chase's excellent series. He also has his radio broadcasts he does right there in the Sevierville area. So some of you local folks over there in Eastern Tennessee have probably heard those. But everybody, no matter where you are, if you look on YouTube, you will find Chasing History. Chase just has tremendous energy and excitement and a true passion for these subjects. So, we support his efforts as much as he supports ours. And of course, don't forget that you can also find the 7 Ages Research Associates right there on YouTube. All our past episodes, our past video projects, and other updates are available there. If you want to keep up with our work online, you might as well also check out our Instagram, our Twitter, and of course, the Facebook page moderated by our good pal, Jason Pentrail, who's been busy, by the way, over there on the Patreon as well. Gosh, trying to keep up with all these social media outlets is difficult enough as it is, Jason. I don't know how you actually manage them and also produce this content.
Well, it's a lot of late nights, to say the least, but I enjoy it. And tell you what, we're having a great time over there at Patreon. Again, if you enjoy this show, please head over there and check out what we do. Patreon.com/7ages podcast, or you can just head over to Patreon and type in 7 Ages and it's going to come up. We're steadily growing over there. We're growing the catalog as well. We have a couple of different podcasts over there. We have the Cross Time Pub, where we're doing more interviews. We're doing special segments that you've come to love and hear here on the main show, such as History of Alcohol, Famous Feuds. We also have some new ones that are going to be coming up here at the beginning of the year. So lots of good content. We also have another podcast over there that I do called Digging Deeper, where we bring on guests and we're able to really get into the details with no time limit, and we just finish out the interview when it's time to wrap it up. And it's a really good, comprehensive podcast that's also available there on the Patreon. And we have some exciting new things coming up, book clubs and all sorts of other things for you there, extra content over at the Cross Time Pub on our Patreon channel. So yeah, join us there. It's a good time. We have 3 levels of membership, and we're growing every week. So yeah, if you enjoy the show, please check it out.
Yeah, I got to personally thank you. You know, I mean, being a guy who's got multiple interests, far too many of them, in fact, who spends many of his days corresponding with aerospace and defense officials and folks at national laboratories and writing about their exploits and endeavors, and then by night is on the road, going out there and performing bluegrass, singing and strumming at various barbecues throughout the Southeast. That, in addition to all the other stuff that I like to do, podcasting and, you know, writing and research, it really helps to have formidable allies in this business. And thanks to the efforts of, especially of Jason Pentrail, Jason and James teaming up, going out on the road when I've been busy, you know, 7 Ages has maintained its strength and its presence in terms of trying to bring you the very best in history. So thanks to both you guys. Thanks to all of you out there who continue to follow our work. So don't forget about those social media channels. Definitely check out the Patreon. And of course, our entire back catalog can be found at 7ages.org. And with that now, I want to ask you about Poverty Point, the site that, of course, a hush falls over the room every time you bring that up.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this site was our 3rd stop back on our spring mound building tour. And again, when you're heading down Louisiana from north down toward Poverty Point, Chase and I were out on the road. We had been, you know, logging the miles, stopping at different places, and every single place that we stopped at had its own personality, its own feel. And Poverty Point did not disappoint. Now, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site for a very good reason. It is enigmatic, to say the least. It's striking. And when you have a great tour guide, interpreter like Mark Brink, who is the Poverty Point site manager, he knows the site in detail. They have a actual working lab that we were able to go see and meet some of the folks that are working every day out there on the finds and the catalog from Poverty Point. Beautiful museum there. But Mark pays a lot of very close attention to detail. He is an excellent interpreter and a great patron of Poverty Point. Now, it is one of those sites that if you love archaeology and if you're interested in mound building cultures in North America, it is a must on the list. You must go there and see this site because it is the only one, not only in North America, it is the only one in the world that is built in this fashion. And it is truly remarkable to see. I set aside the whole day because if you love the details like Chase and I do, and everyone here at 7 Ages, you're going to want to get there when they open, and you'll probably leave when they close because they're going to have to kick you off the property. Again, Poverty Point is really something unique and special in North American history.
Yeah, sure sounds like it. I mean, so many of our colleagues have talked about it over the years. I, again, regret that my own schedule didn't allow me to get down there with you guys, but I'm so glad that you and Chase made the trip and that you, the listeners, will soon be hearing, as James and I will, about the adventures from Mark Brink, who Jason and Chase were able to speak with while they were down there. The Poverty Point site manager now brings us the inside scoop on one of the most enigmatic sites in North America. Mark Brink joins us on the other side of this break. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
7 Ages and Chasing History back on the road. We have made our way south to Poverty Point after spending all day yesterday at Spiro Mounds out in Oklahoma. So a little change of scenery here as we've made our way down into the beautiful state of Louisiana. And we are joined today by park manager Mark Brink. So he is here. He's got about 6 years worth of experience here at Poverty Point. He's joining us to tell us all about this World Heritage Site. We have had this on the list for a long time, Mark. We are very excited to be here to see everything that this site has to offer. One of the oldest and most important archaeological sites in North America. So again, thank you for having us. We are happy to be here, and it's going to be a big day for the 7 Ages and Chasing History team.
Yeah, happy to have y'all down for a visit. Excited to be chatting about Poverty Point and get this out there.
Yeah, well, that's what we do. We're happy to be here. We really hope that everyone is able to look further into this site at the end. We always encourage you to follow up with everything we're going to teach you here today and talk about, because we have a lot to cover. So, Mark, beginning with your history. So you are a dedicated historian, someone who has an education in history. Tell us a little bit about that.
So that's a good question. My background is in history, although today I'm not a real historian. The focus is interpretation. So I'm a dedicated interpreter. But my bachelor's and master's are both in history, and I even went abroad for the master's. And I went to Queen's University, Belfast, so I was in Northern Ireland for a couple years. And I did have some background in public history there. And it's a little bit of a different discipline. So the focus of interpretation or public history or archaeology is making sure that the people can connect, right? Because if you speak to a room and you say all the right stuff and you say completely accurately and no one understands you, did it make a difference? So that's the art of interpretation, is taking, sometimes very complicated information and making it approachable and easier for the public to connect with.
Absolutely, and those are all great points. Certainly, as we've learned on this trip, the interpretation is key, and we've been very fortunate to have some great speakers and people that we've worked with so far up to this point. And so, again, that is vitally important. So that's, again, why we encourage everyone to come out to these sites, support these sites, and be able to interact with people like yourself, Mark, who can interpret that information so that it makes more sense. Much better than just reading it in text or watching it on TV. You really need to come out and support these sites, and that's been a theme of this trip so far. So as we get into the site here at Poverty Point, let's begin with the sort of 30,000-foot view of the site. So we're dealing with a very old and ancient site here. So let's begin with, if you will, the start of Poverty Point.
Okay. So the 30,000 foot view up is actually really apt, but we'll talk about that later. So the site began by about 1730 BCE. So just over, 3,700 years ago, native peoples here started to create a community, right, and create mounds on this site. And the first one was Mound B that we can determine, built around 1650 BCE. A small conical mound, only about 21 feet high or so, 180 feet in diameter. And the people built that after a 1,000-year gap or hiatus of native people building mounds in Louisiana, which is where this tradition starts, somewhere around 7,000 years ago. The difference with Poverty Point is that these mounds were much larger in scale, more complicated than any of the other mounds we've seen up to this point in North American prehistory.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So let's kind of just back up there for a minute, because when I first started reading about this site and learning about it, I was surprised to see that there were other mound complexes, much older than Poverty Point proper. So things like the Lower Jackson Mound, and I was reading about Watson Break and other things that are in the area that could potentially predate the site. So we're looking at hunter-gatherers. Yeah. We're talking archaic here, hunter-gatherers moving in. And what indications do we have as to why those first mounds, those pre-Poverty Points, may have been built? Any speculations, anything like that?
I'm just going to say ceremonial, which is an archaeologist's way of saying we have absolutely no idea, right? We assume they're built for a purpose. The very first mounds, which are not even built in the late Archaic. So Poverty Point is built in the late Archaic. The first are built in the Middle Archaic.
Right.
Sometimes a couple thousand years earlier than this site. And we don't see them as residential centers. They are built as monuments representing something. Some have a lot more evidence for use seasonally, even as camps, and others don't have any occupational debris from really much of anything. It's hard to say. We can identify 16 of those Middle Archaic mound sites as of now, and they include things like Lower Jackson Mound, just next to the site, the LSU campus mounds. Those are Middle Archaic. You have the Watson Brake Complex, which people get really excited about, but you can't quite visit yet.
Right.
And then a host of others all throughout this area. And most are in Louisiana, with a couple in Mississippi. And we actually suspect that there are dozens more. We just don't have dates on them yet.
It's all very interesting because it's such an anomaly, but it kind of harkens, to the beginning of this mound building idea or culture. And as we were driving in today, looking at the landscape, we were thinking, is it because of the bayous? Is it because of the marsh? Are they trying to get higher ground? Just trying to throw around any idea of, what would have initiated that sort of practice. And as you said, I guess we just have to leave it up to the imagination for now until technology can maybe help us figure it out a little bit better, or research methods.
Right. Geologically, why this spot? What is it about? Because, like when we were driving into here, there's flat forever, And so what is it about this particular spot in this general area that Native peoples would choose to settle here?
Okay, good question. Jason, you mentioned that you speculated maybe mounds are for getting out of, floodwaters, and I hear that a lot. The thing is, if you are an ancient person and you're looking to build anything, right? A house, a mound, a church, would you build it where it floods?
Probably not.
You wouldn't. No. And ancient people would not build mounds where it flooded most of the time.
Well, maybe if you worshipped water.
Yeah.
Then,
Yeah,
right.
Maybe.
But we don't think these people worshipped water, right? Maybe something else. We don't know anything about their cultural beliefs. So that's hard to say, and a little disingenuous to speculate at right now.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
But geologically, this is interesting. So Poverty Point sits on a Pleistocene or an Ice Age ridge that puts you up around 20 or 30 feet above the floodplain. And I know it looks flat to the naked eye, but you are on much more elevated ground than the rest of the delta, because this is very new land, only about 14 to 13,000 years old. And the people at Poverty Point picked this area at the edge of this ridge. It's the highest point along the Mason Ridge, just about, and they built their earthworks here. So they didn't have to deal with flooding from the Mississippi about 15 miles east, but still had good access to that lifeline.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
So we're beginning to put the picture here together. We now know why they chose the area, but it's certainly enigmatic, to say the least, of the way that it's designed and the way that it's laid out. In fact, so much so that it's unique in the entire world. We've never seen a complex laid out in this manner before, North America or anywhere for that matter. So let's begin with a general description of the layout of the site and what we can understand about the way that it may be distributed across the landscape here.
Okay. Yeah, you're exactly right. People overuse the word unique, but here it is not an exaggeration. It is a one-of-a-kind site. So in the center is Central Plaza, measuring about 43 acres, and that is huge by itself. And like a site like Marksville, okay, it's a Hopewell age site in Louisiana. It fits just inside the plaza. Most mound sites in North America are fitting only in the footprint of this central area. And believe it or not, it's an earthwork. So it looks boring from the surface, but when you dig in, you understand the plaza was built up, sometimes 4 or 5 feet high. And that is a lot of dirt, or over 43 acres. So you start there. There's even a little mound, Mound C, that's currently in the plaza. And you have a bunch of other little features, post circles, timber circles that were constructed here over a long period of time. Outside, you find other earthworks. You find the ridges. There's 6 semi-elliptical concentric ridges that fan out almost like a rainbow, and they're nested together. And these ridges were built between 4, maybe 7 feet high in some areas, built to be level across their tops. And we think this was the residential nature of the site, the community. People lived on the tops of the ridges after their construction, maybe around 1450 to 1400 BCE. And then outside of those 6 nested ridges, you find the 3 largest mounds at the site. You have Mound B in the north, that's the oldest one. You have Mound A dead center, and that is the largest of the mounds. And then you have Mound E in the south, and that's your only true platform mound on the site. And it's really unique. None of the mounds look exactly like each other, so they likely had very different purposes as far as we can tell.
And so getting into some of the specifics, the ridges, let's begin there because it's the most striking feature, well, one of the most striking features and certainly unique. Now, how wide are the ridges?
About 50, 60 feet wide most of the time.
Okay. And then if I understand it correctly, the canals or the ditches, if you will, the
swales.
All right.
Yeah.
There's the proper
They're
term.
not quite ditches. They
Right.
probably didn't hold water when the people lived here.
But those are the result of digging up to build the ridge, or
yes,
is that
they
coming?
would dig into the swales and then pile that dirt up to create the ridges.
Okay, and then it's smoothed off flat across the top of the ridge.
Yes. So the natural elevation changes along the ground, right? Along this mason ridge on which the people lived. And so that necessitated ridges to be shorter in some areas and higher in others to deal with that ground level difference, the elevation difference. So it is actually a lot of engineering if you think about the land leveling that these people went through to create these massive earthworks. And the scale is important, right? Why does the elevation change so much? Because the ridges, the outermost, is about 1 kilometer in diameter. This is massive. If you stretch them out end to end, the ridges equal about 6.5 miles.
Wow.
That's incredible. And that was actually going to be my next question. So I'm glad you brought that up. Again, such a unique feature. And now the way that they're oriented, would they be facing the water feature, or would they be facing toward the central mound, or does it really matter?
What do you mean by facing?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to envision the homes or the people living up on the ridges. Was there anything, astronomical alignment wise, or rising of the sun, easterly direction or westerly, anything that, as far as the orientation of the way they're facing, as far as the houses are built, or as far as the habitation is concerned?
It's a good question. So the ridges are quote unquote open to the east and closed to the west. We don't know what significance that held to the people, but there's been interpretation on it. But it's interpretation that may not be as useful as we'd like, because it extrapolates back from the historic and present day tribes and nations and their beliefs on these people 3,000 years before historic tribes and nations. So that's the difficulty we have in interpreting their personal and cultural beliefs, because if I ask you who your ancestors were 3,000 years ago, what do you know about them? What language did they speak? What religion did they practice? There's a lot of difference there.
Sure.
And so we can't use the interpretation that sites like Cahokia or Spiro could have, because those are much younger sites. And you have a lot better understanding of the cultural nature of these places. But Poverty Point, we have none. So we use more of a ground-up approach instead of a top-down approach for interpretation.
Well, that's a very interesting way of looking at it. And so we're certainly going to get into some more of the features of the site, but as we begin to try to wrap our mind around, the hows and the whys, one thing that we are missing, like you just said, is a lot of those clear-cut answers. It's an enigma in that we don't have a lot to pull from, but as far as the artifacts that are present on the site, what can that relate to the story to kind of fill in some of the gaps?
Sophistication. So as soon as this site pops up, you have a wealth of new artifact styles that didn't exist before. Lots of projectile points. There's like over a dozen different projectile point types that these people used in the previous period. People prefer to use only like 3 types. There is a cooking technology that is developed distinctly for these people using earthen ceramic balls. So people often call them clay, but they're actually made of the dirt. It's fired into a ceramic. They're called poverty point objects, and they are unique to the site. And if you find them at another site, okay, you know that it's tied to this culture in some way, shape, or form. There is massive culture emanating from this place. And people cooking with poverty point objects is a sure sign that there is a connection to this ancient site.
Yeah, and those particular implements are something that I just found to be, bizarrely interesting in the way that they're made, the way that they're created. What is it about the archaeology? So where they're being found, what is it about that that's indicative of cooking? How do you know that it was used for that?
Right. So oftentimes you find them clustered in features that represent hearths or something along those lines. We find them in, domestic areas where we'd find debris for housing. So it suggests a lot of domestic use. And residue samples have been taken from poverty point objects. They're often caked in starch, for example. So we are pretty sure they're used for cooking. They may have had other uses. And what's distinctive about them, because people, other places, actually cook with this sort of thing, right? But they're usually not in distinct shapes. The people here created at least 6 standard shapes, and there is meaning there. And if we can find these shapes of poverty point objects in another site, that there's a tie-in.
Sure.
Because there's no way around it. But other places they made more like amorphous or circular kind of pieces of fired earth.
So looking at the various shapes that we're talking about here, is the shape more indicative of transfer of heat for cooking abilities, or is it more of sort of a signature of poverty point, or do we know?
This is interpretation on my part.
Sure.
We don't know. Okay, first of all, we don't know. There has not been a defined study on this. There was one guy, John Gibson, who drank a bunch of beers and tested it by himself, and
nice.
He says that, the different shapes change the surface area and the amount of heat brought to play, and that's true, but we don't know that's the intended purpose or not, right? And people cooked without the shapes just fine. And most people in North America cooked with hot rocks instead of these things.
Sure.
And they did just fine. So all signs point to the shapes being symbolic of something. And we don't know what it is. And they seem to be just about the only thing that leaves the site in any significant numbers as far as exchange goes. So there's some archaeologists who believe that they were trinkets that people took home after visiting this site. And they took the idea home, and they often made them, because you can make them with different kinds of dirt, and they were used for cooking.
How far away do you find these radiating out from the site? I mean, are they 30 miles, 50 miles, 100 miles? Hundreds.
Yeah, there's sites in Florida along the Atlantic coast that showcase these poverty point objects, and you can find them as far north as like Missouri, Kentucky, a little bit in Indiana. Yeah.
Wow, they're traveling that far.
They are.
That is cool.
Yeah, they travel pretty far. And Gulf Coast is where you're going to find most of them.
Mm-hmm.
There was a big poverty point culture component along the Gulf Coast. That was an important place for these folks.
Are there any other items that are traveling as far afield?
Good question. One of the owl pendants that is associated with the site is found in the site in Florida as well.
Okay.
But most of the time, it's just the poverty point objects. Some archaeologists have called this place a black hole because it sucks in all these materials, all these people, all these influences, and it doesn't radiate a lot out except for these poverty point objects. It's pretty interesting.
Well, so on that point, what are you seeing coming into the site? So are we seeing things from the west? Are we seeing things from the coastal zones in Florida? Things like in the Mississippi, and where we see the shells and the copper and all of those things coming into locations like Spiro and Cahokia. Do you have import materials from other places?
Yes, you do.
And what are those?
There's no native stone here. The closest gravel deposits even are about 30 or 40 miles west. And a lot of the stone is more exotic, coming from hundreds of miles away throughout the Mid-South, a touch into the Midwest, But basically, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, you're going to find a lot of stone coming in from there. Arkansas as well, up into Missouri, and a little bit in Iowa. We can find galena on the site. The copper is interesting because we sent off 6 samples of copper, and none of them came from the Great Lakes. And we had assumed that for a long time.
Really?
So we sent off 26 more samples. They're just waiting to be tested. But these labs are overwhelmed, so they've been sitting on a shelf for 2 years because we're in line. Right, we got to go through all the other samples. It's possible they come from a variety of sources. We just know that our 6 samples came from an Appalachian source.
Wow. So the mystery only deepens.
Yeah, right. And it's likely that a lot of copper that Native peoples used actually came from an Appalachian source that they understood existed that we don't think about today.
Sure.
So
or even exhausted sources,
Yeah. If you go to Georgia and see the Etowah site, for example, I bet you a bunch of that copper doesn't come from the Great Lakes because they had a source much closer by.
Sure. So at this time period, you have these, mounds being erected. There's high culture going on. There's imports, there's exports, there's obviously trade routes. Are there any items that can be traced back to any other central location, something like Kolomoki Mounds or any other larger complexes? Do we see sort of a beginning to that kind of Mississippian culture of trade?
So none of the other complexes exist. This is the only big mound complex of the late Archaic. All these other sites that you visited won't be built for another 2,000 years.
Sure.
Yeah, with Kolomoki being the earliest, that's an early woodland, isn't it?
Yeah, it's right on the line.
Yeah. Right
so, I didn't know if there was like a progenitor of that, of a slow establishment that would later become that, but there's no defined groups of Archaic people out there that you can clearly point to and say that comes from this area. Correct. Or from other than the material itself.
Yes. And that's the question is, because we don't know whether these materials get here through trade, some kind of other exchange, or acquisition. Acquisition is the most likely, judging on the evidence right now, because we don't find trade goods from Poverty Point at these other locations. We find the Poverty Point objects, which are basically worthless because they're made of fired earth. You can get that anywhere. So it shows you that ideas transferred, but we don't find anything like hard material-wise. So
when you say acquisition, you're saying the people from Poverty Point are going out, collecting these materials, and then bringing them back onto site.
Right.
Wow.
So it's now all of it's still possible. If it was trade, then whatever they were trading was perishable. When we think that is not food, because these people imported food, right? This was the largest community in North America at the time. You don't want to give away your food for these folks. But maybe they were expert basket weavers or dugout makers, something along those lines. Because when you look at any ancient site in the Southeast, you're looking at the tip of the iceberg as far as tech goes. You're just seeing the stone. You're missing almost all of the wood, almost all the bone artifacts. Right? And these people were sophisticated. We're just missing most of that sophistication.
That's a great point, and something that we actually talk about quite a bit here on the show. Those perishable technologies really define the culture, and the point is just a tool. And so when we look at the regions, so what food sources, what were they eating here? What were they able to use to grow it? So we're not looking at agricultural scenarios. So they're just sheerly living off of the water and typical game for the area, right?
Right. So the thing to think about is that these were hunters, fishers, and gatherers. That's the preferred term nowadays. And we usually overemphasize the hunting for sure and overemphasize the fishing somewhat. Most of the answer comes from the gathering. So does a plant run away from you if you want to eat it? It doesn't, right?
Yep.
But deer do.
Sure.
But fish are hard to catch some days, right? You don't get lucky. Most of the food they were eating was gathered, and that is true in almost any rich environment like this one. We're just missing a lot of the evidence for it because, again, that's extra perishable. We overestimate hunting in almost every context in the world, except your Arctic context, because you have better bone preservation, right? Than leafy green vegetation. You're never going to find evidence for them eating, leafy greens in the spring. So that's part of the archaeology that we'll forever miss. But we can safely assume that they were gathering a whole lot. Yeah.
What's the population size? So, I mean, you've got a very large complex here.
Yeah.
And then you've got the landscape has to support that large group in just a hunting and gathering basis, no agriculture.
Yes.
So how many people are here and how far could they reach before exhausting the immediate food supply?
Okay. So anthropologically, if you're in a rich environment, as this is termed, this is a rich environment, hunters, fishers, and gatherers would only need to run out at least, 3 or 4 miles. You're only working maybe 4 to 6 hours a day, max. Okay. So you got that going for you. We don't know the population. That's something archaeologists they'll tell you different things. And there was even a big debate, in the 70s and 80s, whether this was a residential place, right? You have people living here year round, or if it was just occasionally used for ceremonies and built up by not a resident population. And I think both are true. I think that there was a year-round population. The archaeology speaks to that. We can find so much material here that people were likely sedentary. We can find foodstuffs from every season and the year that suggests year-round occupation. We just don't know if the residents were several hundred or 1 to 2,000 at most. Now, for big construction projects, big festivals, right? This place brought in visitors in some way, shape, or form. The population swelled. But we don't know when these sorts of things peak, when these festivals or big gatherings were as of yet. So it's a good question.
Building on that point, so looking at the site, we have the ridges, and is there a delineated set of post holes or anything that shows permanent dwellings being there? Do they seem to be seasonal? Do they seem to be temporary? What do we think?
We don't know. Okay, so that's going to be an answer to a lot today. Now, here's the thing. I can tell you more about it. The issue with this site and a lot of really ancient sites is that the environment hurts these earthworks tremendously.
Absolutely.
So you're dealing with 3,000 plus years of erosion after the abandonment of the site. And I ask you, do trees hurt the earthworks? They do. This is called bioturbation. So tree roots, they get big, they burrow into the ground, right, amongst these ridges. And what happens if there's a big windstorm? They fall over, and all of that dirt comes up with the root system. And that is going to interrupt any patterns of post holes that were on the very top of the ridges, right? And people use those surfaces after they were built. But now all the original surface is eroded away, and it's in between in the swales. So we can find all the cultural material, the artifacts, but we don't have the right placement as the people left them. And the houses were likely wattle and daub. Okay, so wattle, framework of sticks, daub is the mud that cases them. And that framework is likely very skinny, right? Probably a lot of cane, river cane, switch cane, whatever you want to call it. And that framework it's hard to find. Yeah. So we are coming up with answers. I would be out in the lookout for the next year or so for a paper on a house floor. May or may not be a house floor, we're not sure. But we did the work on it last fall. And it was a re-excavation of a unit from 1991. And let me tell you, archaeologists can take some really poor notes sometimes. And this guy didn't take great notes. So that's why we had to re-excavate. And it looks really interesting. The stratigraphy, the layers, and the unit are really wild. And it looks like we have some kind of interesting feature, whether it's house floor or not. Let's wait for the paper.
Yeah, absolutely.
Put the cart before the horse. If that's true, we do know the surface is underneath the creation of the ridge. So keep in mind that the site as you're seeing it today is the final draft of what the people intended. The ridges were not built at the outset in 1700 BCE. They were built a few hundred years later, and people were still living on the site in the interim before the ridges were created.
Wow, that's fascinating. So it's literally time stacked on top of time, and that's
archaeology.
Yep, that's it. Layers of stratigraphy, right? We're looking at the cake.
Yeah.
But I've never thought about that. I've always thought sheerly about the ridges themselves. I never considered what may lie beneath. What about the surrounding area? Has there been any ground penetrating radar? Any type of non-invasive survey of the surrounding area to look for post holes and other types of features?
We're trying to focus on the site first. We'll get to that later, but we do GPR surveys. We do magnetometer surveys. That's actually what's most helpful on the site is magnetometer work. And that just acts as an MRI. So it finds features with different magnetic resistances. So that's how we find all the post holes in the plaza, for instance. And we expand that survey area. We get more detail. We bring in better, different equipment to understand more about the site. And right now, the interesting part is the plaza as far as that goes. When we're able to look outside the plaza, when that stops being interesting, we'll do more elsewhere.
Well, let's pick it up there. Let's talk about the plaza. We're going to get into some more of the individual portions of the site and talk about the archaeology that's been done here. But the plaza, as I was reading about it, is a very striking feature because it just looks pretty unimpressive now because it's even with the landscape. But you mentioned it earlier, but give us a good detailed description of exactly what we're looking at and how big and maybe the purpose of that plaza.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here now.
Let's do it.
So the plaza in the past decade has quickly become one of the more interesting parts of the site. And we assumed for a long time that plazas were generally sterile areas, right? So you're not going to find a lot of features in a plaza. And that can be true with Mississippian age sites, but certainly not from this site. So we found that it's a constructed earthwork. And originally, we find that 98% of our soil cores, we dig them down to subsoil, and yet we don't find the natural surface of the soil underneath. And that shows us that this is a big borrow area. So they dug out the plaza. They borrowed it for the creation of ridges or mounds or something like that. And yet they said, hey, wait, guys, we messed up. And they put the dirt back, except a lot more of it. So we find it was used as a borrow area. We find it was used to create massive timber circles. And then sometime late in the period, we don't know the date yet, this plaza was filled back in and brought up sometimes 4 or 5 feet high. So that is tremendous. It shows how dynamic a place this is, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg. So I mentioned earlier that you're looking at the final draft, but these earthworks were changed and reshaped by the people, sometimes quite a lot, and the plaza is one example of it. So just to flesh out the timber circles, we don't know what they're used for. We don't know what the plaza was used for. Again, you can just say ceremony or what have you, ritual. Sure. But we do know that they were replaced and built over a long period of time. So when we do the magnetometer surveys, we don't find the ancient rotten posts. We find a different fill soil because once they were done, they pulled up the post and they dumped different dirt in. And because it doesn't come from around the plaza exactly, it shows up in the mag surveys as a different resistance. But we can get wood fragments from these that remain inside these fill episodes, and we can date these features. And the oldest one we've dated is, roughly 1600 to 1650 BCE. So they're definitely making them at the beginning of the period. And the last one we see is sometime just after 1200 BCE. And it looks like they were built, removed, and rebuilt over the long duration, almost the entire time that the people lived here. So even as other things change on the site, all the mounds and ridges, they all look a little unique from each other. These post circles do not. So they represent some kind of cultural continuity with these people, even if we don't understand why they were built.
Sure. Well, are there any indications of, again, this would have to be speculation because I guess we just don't know, but astronomical alignments, seasonal variations? Are we looking at a calendar system, which is why it may have stayed when everything else changed, something that was a constant?
Right now, we don't think any of that is true.
Interesting.
Right now, we don't see any celestial alignments that I would be confident of on the site, and certainly not with the post circles or timber circles as of yet. And today on the site, we have white cylinders to mark the diameters of these features. It does not show you how many posts exist. And so in most cases, these posts are pretty darn close together. You could just fit 1 or 2 people between each post. So they were really quite an undertaking. And that's probably why they had to move them so often, because you don't want to, put them back in the same exact place, because removing these features would have disturbed all the soil around and made it kind of soft and not very structural. So
yeah, that makes sense.
And they were big. So a lot of these posts are over 2 feet in diameter. So using really big pieces of cypress so far. So all the fragments we can find are all of cypress, which is a rot-resistant wood local to the area. But they would have had to pull it from the floodplain. And again, these people were living off the floodplain just next to the site.
Is there any indication of like burning of the bottom of the posts or anything like that to prevent water to seepage and that sort of thing?
100%. So yeah, all the bits we find are charred. So they were treating the wood before they put the posts in.
Very good. So I guess what I'm trying to get from Poverty Point, and we're going to get into the mounds themselves here in a moment, but I'm looking for, I guess, sort of a blueprint for what we see later from Mississippian cultures or for other mound building cultures, whether it be the Ohio Valley cultures of the Adena and the Hopewell. Does it seem that Poverty Point could be sort of a blueprint for what we see later, or is it just an anomaly?
I don't think so. I think all these cultures are extremely different from each other. The late Archaic has kind of a hard break from the woodland as far as culture goes. Something happened at the end of the late Archaic, and we're not sure what it is. So one guy suggested it's climate change that created this hard break, which would have caused colder temps and localized flooding in low areas for a few hundred years. So after Poverty Point ends, whatever this period is, around 1100 BCE, we don't find any other sites in this region for another 300 years. So there is a big gap in the archaeology that happens, and the culture shifts in a big way. So whatever happened here, we're not sure how much of that passed on to the mound builders of what would be the future for these folks.
Sure. So yeah, I was just wondering, was there any definitive thing that sort of gives us that blueprint? But that's a great explanation, and the first time I've heard someone make it so clear. So I think that, again, just adds to the mystery, and we don't want to keep using these words of mystery and enigmatic and unique, but it truly is. It's a very unusual site. Everything from the construction down to the artifacts, the things we see moving out. But it was a power center of some sort, and obviously very important for a very long time. So as we turn in our discussion to the archaeology of the site, let's start with Mound B. We discussed that a little bit earlier, but kind of take us through some of the mounds and the archaeology that's been done, and what have we learned so far about those mounds?
Okay, so Mound B was the first mound built after almost 2,000-year hiatus of mound building in Louisiana. So it's the first of what would become very many at the site. So it's built in a layered construction, like you would expect with most mounds. So they strip the surface first. They remove the grass, native grass, not like it is today. So it's kind of clumpier. So just getting you into their mindset a little bit. The environment was a little different. And then they created 2 thin lenses or layers, right, broadcasted out by hand. And then they started building major construction phases. So there's 4 big construction phases. And on some of these levels, you can find some charcoal scattering, a few small post holes, but it doesn't seem to represent any kind of residence for an important person. Likely ceremony, ritual, right? We don't know.
Sure.
And eventually they cap it. So by capping, it's a common thing with mounds. You would ice the cake, right? So you have all the layers, you built the layers of your cake, and then you put icing on top. So it's like putting a big blanket of dirt, and it turns that flat cake into a conical cake.
Sure.
They really like to heap that icing right on the top, okay? And today, if you look at Mound B, it's kind of humpbacked, right? It's got some kind of big divot in it, and people wonder what it's from. And let me tell you, archaeologists did it in the 50s when they trenched the mound. So when you see a conical mound, in many cultures, it represents where you would find what? what do people think mounds are for?
Burials.
Burials, right. So early archaeologists were often a little better than grave robbers. Okay, think of Indiana Jones when you think of some early archaeologists. Now, I will tell you that grave goods give us a better understanding of the people, but they didn't get lucky. They found that it was built in the layered construction, right? They found some charcoal, a few scattered artifacts, but certainly not nearly as much as they thought. And it started the theme of this site being really weird because every time we dig into these mounds, we don't find any evidence of use by the people. Certainly not like you would find with a Mississippian age site or even a middle woodland or an early woodland site.
Yeah, it's all very fascinating. And so we do see some of those norms just of the icing as you described it. We've heard that, many times before when we've been discussing mounds. And I think it's there's only so many ways to do it. But as we begin to look at the other structures, the central mound.
But one more thing about Mound B before we move forward. So what is interesting is whenever we talk about these mounds and most mounds in particular, you talk about basket-loaded soil.
Yes.
And in Mound B, we find impressions of the ancient baskets and bags that the people used to build it. So in the uppermost level, okay, just before the capping phase, we can find dark stains and little circles. And people thought that these were post holes at first. James Ford and Clarence Webb excavate in the 50s. They these kind of look like post circles, but they're weird because at the edges of these stains, they would be indented. And so we figured out that these are stains from ancient baskets and bags, maybe made of animal hide, that indented as they touched each other.
Wow.
So they left behind some of these impressions for us to find today.
That's incredible.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, again, something that you just don't normally. It's good that someone thought to put those things together and think about it that way. That's truly incredible. So as we begin to get into the rest of the mounds.
Well, I would like to take you temporally, time-wise, through the site. So Mound B was built first.
Let's do that.
Let's talk about Mound E next, because we do have dates for Mound E now. So it was built sometime just after 1500 BCE. It was the second mound that was built. And remember, this is about 150 years after B. So it shows you again that generations happen between construction of different mounds and earthworks. And this one looks very similar to Mound B in construction, except they leave it flat. And it's several times bigger. It's about the size of 2 football fields smashed together. And that's a lot of dirt if you stack it 13 feet high. So it doesn't look impressive on the landscape today, but at the time, 1500 BCE or so, it would have been one of the largest mounds in North America. But you wouldn't know it next to Mound A. That's just just to the north of it. But in any case, we find fewer artifacts in Mound E than any other mound that we've investigated. It wasn't known to be a mound until 1992, 1993, when we finally found that some of these dirt layers didn't belong with each other. So we could find the loading, the artificial construction of this mound, and 4 main phases. So pretty similar to what you find at Mound B. And again, we don't know what the heck it's for, but the platform suggests that a lot of people could fit up there, so probably lots of pomp and circumstance, dances, what have you. We're not sure. What also we found is that there's a ridge that was built connecting Mound E all the way across the ridges. It bisects all 6 ridges. It enters the plaza, and then it likely connects to Mound C, which is all the way in the plaza. So again, as we do more archaeology, we find more weird stuff.
Okay, hold on. I'm trying to visualize this.
Yeah, this is very hard to do.
And I think we caught a glimpse of it on your wall over there. There was a type of there was some
exactly.
Some new scan. Okay,
so this is the point
at.
where you zoom to a graphic and you can see the ridge, I guess.
Right.
But in podcast form, it's hard to do.
Yeah.
Right.
So you've got a ridge that connects a row of the other ridges and this platform.
The ridge from Mound E to Mound C likely predates the 6 ridges.
Okay.
That was my next question.
So here's the thing. Like, it's really hard to imagine the site. Imagine how it changes a lot over 600 years of use. So at the beginning, there's just Mound B. And there's a community of people, actually probably pretty close to Mound B and what we today call Mound B Field. There looks like some occupation debris, but it's very different in the early period as these people are coming together and creating their culture. And then you have Mound E constructed. And then the plaza is being used for something, right? It's used as borrow area, but you also have post circles there even when Mound B is created. So they're doing something there. And then they create the ridges. And then they create a causeway that crosses a borrow area to the south of Mound E. And then after all of that is created, you have Mound A, the last largest construction. And you have one mound built after that. It's Mound F that we don't know a whole lot about yet. But that was built maybe 1200 to 1250 BCE. But it's a very small project compared to Mound A.
So what is the time difference between the initial Mound B and then the eventual Mound A?
Okay, Mound B to A, it's about 400 years difference.
Okay, so we're talking vast amounts of time. So they were pretty comfortable here for a while with just having B, and then we slowly begin to add on these other features. So at a minimum, B was sort of the progenitor, but that was still a great distance of time between the Jackson Mound further off the property and then B. So we're setting up the timeline of Jackson Mound being the oldest. And then what is the time between Jackson and Mound B?
About 1900 years.
So that's absolutely incredible.
But remember, it's not the same people building.
Right. We're talking, it's just in the same region. Yeah.
Yes. So that's a tough thing. People look at a mound and they think that they're all connected, but they rarely are.
Right. Well, it's interesting that, we have a huge gap of time between the Lower Jackson Mound and then Mound B. And then the establishment of Mound B, they're comfortable there for a while. And then we slowly, over hundreds of years, see it eventually end with the ridges, the other mounds, and then Mound A.
Yeah.
So tell us about Mound A.
Okay, so Mound A is probably the first thing you're going to notice when you pull up at the site because it is huge. Even today, it is the second largest constructed mound or earthwork in what is today the U.S. or Canada. So the largest is Monk's Mound at Cahokia, but Mound A was built 2,200 years before Monk's Mound.
Wow.
So it shows you that this was the biggest for a long time, and it was built by hunters, fishers, and gatherers, and that's not something I can overestimate. So you look at these monuments, archaeologists originally thought that these people had agriculture for a long time. James Ford and Clarence Webb in the 50s originally thought this was like the biggest Hopewellian site you've ever seen. And yet you do the archaeology, and we find it is much older than that. And Mound A is massive in terms of construction. It's 390,000 tons of soil roundabouts. In today's terms, that's just over 30,000 standard dump trucks. But without dump trucks and without horses or donkeys to carry the loads, the people carried in, right? Passing baskets along. About 15.5 million loads, if you're calculating about 50 pounds per basket.
Wow.
You have thousands of laborers, millions of loads, the single largest mound in what we call North America today.
That's absolutely incredible. And so what do we think of when we're looking at the archaeology? Do we see that same sort of layer after layer? I mean, obviously, but is it over a large amount of time? How long does it look like it took to construct Mound A?
So that's the question, isn't it? So there's an archaeologist, T.R. Kidder, and he did work on Mound A in 2005, 2006 with a couple of different field schools. And his analysis suggests that during construction, there is no natural erosion that happened. So normally when you get a mound, you have those layers, right? And those layers are distinct because they take breaks, right? And weathering happens on those surfaces. Trees grow. Grass grows, insects burrow, rain happens. And in his analysis, so he trenched part of the platform and took a series of 89 soil cores from throughout the mound. His analysis didn't show any of that. So what does it tell us today? What does it suggest?
That it was built much faster?
Yeah, it was built in a single episode. That's his interpretation. And his thought is that it was built between 30 and 90 days. So not only was it the biggest, it certainly was the quickest to go up. And we don't see any other mounds like it in the world, as far as I'm concerned, as far as speed of construction and size. So not even the Mississippian folks were able to accomplish anything like that.
Wow.
So as you are probably skeptical,
I'm not even sure what to say about that.
Yeah.
as you are skeptical, many archaeologists are also skeptical. But it's the best evidence we have right now. So until someone provides something else, that's the interpretation on Mound A.
So what would be the population numbers that would be required in order to build it that size in that amount of time?
Right. So 3,000 laborers at least, plus all the other people to support, which is 10,000 altogether in the estimation, roundabouts. So you have to have people working on this mound real quick, and you have to feed these people.
Sure.
So it was a planned project. We don't know how long it took to plan, but they got all their resources lined up. They got all their labor and organization lined up. They burned out the land where Mound A is. There's a swampy depression there. They brought it up to level, and then they immediately constructed the cone. So the tallest part of Mound A, okay, that is today 72 feet at its apex. But when this was going up in 1350 BCE, maybe about 90 feet tall. So that was constructed first. And then, quickly afterward, a platform was built to abut, to meet up with that cone facing the eastern part of the mountain. And that is really an interesting construction because unlike the cone, which looks very homogeneous, about all the same as far as soil goes, they put different colored baskets of soil next to each other in the platform to make almost a mosaic. You have tans, you have almost reds, you have grays, whites, blacks. So they quarried soil from different parts of this Mason Ridge and put them with each other to create an interesting kind of mosaic. And then after that, they built a ramp to connect that interesting platform to that tall cone.
That is fascinating.
Wow.
Now, has there been any evidence that's been found of the support structure for, in terms of the people to help feed and, take care of all of these workers who are constructing this? Is there like a, wow, there's a big camp out here and
the ridges.
Okay.
So the ridges could hold thousands and thousands of people. Keep in mind, they're 6.5 miles long.
Right.
If you think about a subdivision today, if you have 6.5 miles of road, you can fit a lot of houses on that road. And the same would be true here. You probably had enough space for your residential population, which again, right now we think is likely that they had, plus all of the visitors who would need to help. Because with that many people at Mound A, you can't feed that many people hunting, fishing, and gathering. You can feed, maybe 1,000 pretty well in this environment, but that many? It's a barn raising, right? It shows you that Poverty Point was a center of something really big that people latched onto and bought into to create what was the largest mound that any of these communities had ever seen.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's absolutely incredible. And I'm trying to, as I always do, envision this happening. And I have a question for you that has been kind of tossed around. So today we tend to look at these sites and we see them covered in grass, and we think that that's how they would have been back then.
Right.
So you just mentioned the different colored soils and clays of a mosaic. So are we to understand that those mosaics would have been visible at all times and that the mound would have been kept clean of grass and debris? And if so, what would hold it together?
So I think it was impossible to keep grass off the mound long term.
Sure.
Right. I don't think that's just really hard to do unless you're just walking on it every day.
Right.
And even grass will grow up the sides. But certainly when it was fresh, there would be, lots of neat colors going on. This is a very colorful looking platform, and they did it all with dirt. We don't know exactly how these mounds were held together so well, but there is thought by many archaeologists that there was some kind of clay cap put on them, but we just don't have hard evidence for it.
Yeah, and do we have any estimate as to, during that time of Poverty Point, rain levels and things like that would affect the mounds?
So during the late Archaic, the climate was almost exactly what it is today. So climate changed a lot from the Paleo period through the early Archaic, middle Archaic, and then late Archaic, almost exactly what you see today. A little bit cooler, climate change and all of that. But, what you expected, like what you had in the 70s, for instance, that was about the climate that these people dealt with, which was, very rainy, hot in the summer, cold in the winter, but not generally not so much snow. So you'd only get like maybe a couple days of snow a year.
Right. So another important part to the site obviously would have been the dock. So this is leading into the site. So what do we know about it, size-wise, archaeology-wise, and how it was used?
Okay. So why do we call it the dock? Because that's where you'd beach your dugouts. And it is, for most visitors here, anciently, 3,000 plus years ago, you beach your dugout, and you enter the site from the dock. And yet, before you reach the dock, before you even walk up, do you have any idea what the site is or what it looks like? Do you think you'd be able to see everything from the water?
Probably not.
You wouldn't, because the site is built on a ridge. Right. There is a very steep bluff along the eastern edge where you'd approach from the dock. And from this point onward, the site is definitely built to impress. So at the top of this very gentle slope that was created at the dock, there is a ridge at the top that obscures view of the site until you crest it. So it is a very awe-inspiring moment for a first-timer here entering from that point. And we think that is on purpose, and it's sort of a change of worlds, if you will. As you crest that ridge, the world you left is no longer in view. So the ridge hides everything behind you. And all you can see are the largest earthworks ever created to that point. So they would all come into focus at once. So that is really an experience and an idea that the site projected power.
Sure.
So that's one thing we can say about the mounds and earthworks, even if we don't understand their ceremonial or cultural function, is that labor, resources, that's something we understand today. It's the same reason why someone buys a Corvette instead of a Camry, right? What's the difference?
The prestige.
Prestige, right? One, you need a lot more money and power, and we're costly signaling. That's what theory is called all the time. If you wear a North Face jacket, do you think that costs more than a non-brand jacket?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it does. So the people were practicing it, even if it wasn't the intent, right? They likely had a lot of religious, cultural, ritualistic intent with these things. But the takeaway is that they were showing their power in a massive way. And they did it all as hunters, fishers, and gatherers living in the largest community for their time. And we don't see any other hunters and gatherers making monuments on this scale or size, not even at Göbekli Tepe or any of these other hunter-gatherer created sites. And we also don't see them using it as a year-round community or occupational center. So with all these pieces in play, it makes Poverty Point something very special.
Absolutely. Are there any indications of palisades, any type of defensive structures, or it was a city center that was just well-known and protected? Anything like that? There
is no evidence of defensive structures at the site. There's no evidence of these people being at odds with anyone, no evidence of slave labor, because I hear that all the time.
Sure.
But most cultures don't build things with slave labor, but it's a common misconception.
So as we wrap up here, obviously at some point, the awe-inspiring Poverty Point goes away.
Right.
So what do we know about the end of Poverty Point?
So the end was likely very gradual, as it is with most sites, unless there's a natural disaster or just they're wiped out by warfare, sacking of the city, or what have you. But we don't see it here. And so there's likely a gradual fading out, like most of your sites, like Cahokia or Spira or what have you. So one guy thinks that there was a climate change event that made things cooler and wetter. And if you're thriving on hunting, fishing, and gathering, and your foodways are interrupted in a big way, you can't live on the same size and scale, things necessarily have to get smaller.
Sure.
So the people start living in fewer and fewer numbers here, likely over a span of decades, until they move off and change their way of life, and the culture is slowly lost.
Absolutely. Well, this is a fascinating site. We've been speaking with Mark Brink, park manager here at Poverty Point, Louisiana, one of the most enigmatic and interesting sites that we've had the pleasure to see on this trip. Mark, thank you so much for your time. If anyone's interested in the site, tell us about your website, your programs, and how they can get in touch with you.
Sure thing. So Poverty Point is operated and managed by Louisiana State Parks. So lastateparks.com. You can pull up our information there. It has our calendar of events for any interpretive programs. You can follow us on Facebook. I'll post up our programs there and any recent information that we learn about the site, articles, what have you. We have a Poverty Point Station Archaeology Facebook page as well that is run by our station archaeologist, Diana Greenlee, and that is worth checking out as well. If you want to call the site, we're always here. We're only closed 3 days during the year. Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's Day. Our phone number is 318-926-5492. We're looking forward to seeing you at the site.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mark. Again, we encourage everyone to come out here and see the site. Support your local sites in your historical areas. Make sure you get out there. All of these sites need your interest and they need your support. So again, thank you, Mark, for joining us. 7 Ages Audio Journal on the road, Poverty Point, Louisiana.
Excellent job as always, Jason. And of course, special thanks to Mark Brink for being our guest, for joining us. Sounds like you had a really, really great conversation with him.
We really did. And again, Mark was so generous with his time. He spent the entire day with us filming, recording, and again, answering all of our questions, and just a true lover of history. He's got a very interesting career path himself. He's been all over the place and has some really great stories to tell. Again, he works with lots of documentaries, obviously being at Poverty Point, so he's very used to working with the media, and you can tell with the time that we spent with him. So again, very special thanks to Mark, and I got to say, he also brews some very good beer. So,
oh wow, yeah, how cool is that? One of these days, maybe when I'm able to settle down and get into a cabin somewhere up in the mountains, I've always intended to get into brewing beer myself, which is more on the chemistry side of my scientific interests. For the time being, I think I'm just as happy keeping it in the realm of physics, space, astronomy, and of course, always archaeology. But, we've got some friends a little further south who share all those interests, and that is, of course, our good buddies Cam and Kyle, the Bruds, down there around Weatherford, Texas. And I hear that they're doing an event later this year. James, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And, they put a little plug in for us on their show, Expanded Perspectives, for the Pinson Mound trip. And I wanted to return the favor to them. So yeah, they're doing a live show on Friday, October 28th at 7 p.m. at Panther Island Brewery in Fort Worth. And I'm tentatively planning to attend that. I think there's going to be a lot of pretty interesting guests. And so if you're in the area, you got time, come by there and hang out, have a brew at the brewery and enjoy the show.
I may very well just come on down there myself because, it's been so long since I've been down there to Texas. And of course, there's quite a lot of archaeology down there as well, a whole lot of history in that general area. But, Cam and his wife, for their anniversary, just last year came up and visited. So I did get to see Cam. Haven't seen Kyle or his kids or the family in many years, and I've been missing them all. So who knows, maybe I'll just have to clear out my schedule that week, come on down there and spend some time with you guys too. But we appreciate those guys. They've always been tremendous supporters of 7 Ages. And if you out there would like to support our efforts as well, again, don't forget about that Patreon. We definitely have all of the information about where you can find that in the show notes, and of course, over at 7ages.org. And you can find all of our information on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and what have you. But, gentlemen, I think at this point, after that fantastic interview, Jason, that you and Chase were able to do, it's about time for us to pony up one more time for a final round. Sadly, no, it's not Louisiana homebrew here, but I'm not going to complain about a good, cold Guinness on draft, which we always keep here at the Crosstime Pub. So, gentlemen, one more round. What say ye?
Cheers.
I had hoped that you might say so. So, ladies and gents, we hope to see you guys again on down the road. Who knows? Maybe on that next trip, we can invite a few of you guys out there to join us on the road. It's always our pleasure to be able to bring you the latest in archaeology, history, and of course the questions we have about the ancient past. On behalf of James Waldo, Jason Pentrail, and yours truly, I am Micah Hanks. It is the 7 Ages Research Associates, and we'll catch you next time right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.